Welcome to this second lesson on group statements preference shares. In this lesson, we will be looking at some examples of how to value the reserves of a preference share holding an investor may have in an investee and how to prepare the analysis of owner's equity. Before we look at the examples, let's discuss how IFRS 3 prescribes we should account for preference shareholdings in a group context. According to IFRS 3, the measurement of preference shares at acquisition date is determined by the rights attached to those shares. The critical driver for the treatment of preference share capital in the group context is the rights that these shares have to the repayment of capital in the event of liquidation. Refer to Lesson 1 for a recap on the meaning of liquidation. If the shareholders are entitled to receive a repayment of the nominal value of their preference share capital upon liquidation of the acquiree, then the acquirer must measure the preference shares at their at-acquisition date fair value. If, however, the preference shareholders are entitled to receive only a proportionate share of the net assets available for distribution upon liquidation of the acquiree, then the acquirer has the option to either measure the preference shares at their at-acquisition date fair value or measure the preference shares at their proportionate share of the acquiree's net identifiable assets. Example 17 in the textbook presents the scenario whereby S Limited's share capital consists of both ordinary and preference shares. P Limited acquires all of the ordinary shares in S Limited, but none of the preference shares. In this example, we are informed that the preference shares are classified as equity. Remember, in Lesson 1, we discussed the importance of the distinction between classifying preference shares as equity or liability. If the preference shares are a liability, then it is not necessary to allocate reserves in the analysis, as the related dividends are not true dividends but rather interest. However, in this example, the preference shares are classified as equity and thus we should allocate accordingly in the analysis in terms of IFRS 3. But how should we go about making this allocation? To determine this, we need to look at the rights of the preference shareholders, as this determines how the reserves will be measured. According to the given information, preference shareholders have a preferential right to the dividends over the ordinary shareholders, and all importantly, they have a right to the return of their nominal investment upon the liquidation of the acquiree. As such, the acquirer has no option but to measure the preference shares at their at-acquisition date fair value. Remember this slide? We are here. The acquirer measures the preference shares at their at-acquisition date fair value. You are by now familiar with the analysis of owner's equity for ordinary shares. As P is the parent of S, such an analysis must be prepared for all classes of equity, and so, once again, we will need to prepare a separate analysis of owner's equity for the preference shareholders. If the preference shareholders had been classified as a liability, no such analysis would have been required. But the example clearly states that these preference shares are classified as equity, and so we would prepare the analysis of owner's equity as follows. Important to note is that although P Limited owns 100% of the ordinary shares, it owns none of the preference shares. We still need to perform the analysis because we need to determine what the non-controlling interest in the investment is for the preference shareholding. As already noted, because the preference shareholders have the right to receive the return of the nominal value of their investment upon liquidation, P Limited has no option but to value the investment at fair value. The given information states that this fair value is 40,000, so we add this to our analysis and work backwards to balance to the equity represented by goodwill NCI of 10,000. Finally, note that P Limited's interest is zero, as it does not have any investment in the preference shares. In example 6.18 on page 402 of group statements, we are presented with the same scenario, except that this time, the preference shareholders are entitled to receive a proportionate share of the net assets available for distribution in the event of a liquidation. Now, given these rights, IFRS 3 allows the preparer an option to either measure the preference shares at their at-acquisition date fair value, much like the previous example, or at the proportionate share of the identifiable net assets. The given information tells us that we should assume that P Limited has elected to measure non-controlling interests at their proportionate share of the acquiree's identifiable net assets at the acquisition date. As such, the analysis of owner's equity for the preference shares will look as follows. In essence, we ignore the given fair value of 40,000. Once again, the parent's share in the at-acquisition reserves is zero, as it owns only ordinary shares and no preference shares. End of lesson 2.